Today I want to share with you how to make fermented cranberry sauce. Now, fermenting fruit is a little different than fermenting vegetables, but don't worry, I've got a lot of tips and tricks so that you can be successful at fermenting cranberries or any other fruit. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferments, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Well, if you're new to fermenting fruit, I want to go over some basics to help you so that you'll be successful. But if you're an old pro at fermenting fruit, I'll be sure to put the timestamps in the description below so you can jump ahead to where I actually start making the fermented cranberry sauce. Now, as I said earlier, fermenting fruit is a little different than fermenting vegetables. And the reason is fruit ferments very quickly. There are three stages that fruit goes through when it's fermenting. It first starts in the lactic acid stage, then it goes into the alcohol stage, and then it goes into the vinegar stage. But if you want to serve fermented fruit that's not alcohol, you need to catch it, basically, when it's in that lactic acid stage. So when your fermented cranberry sauce, or any fermented fruit for that matter, reaches the lactic acid stage, that's the point that you want to get it into your refrigerator. Now, even when ferments, whether they're fruit, vegetables, or any type of ferment, is refrigerated, it still does continue to ferment, just at a much slower rate than if it were at room temperature. But since it is continuing to ferment, and specifically in the case of fruit, which tends to ferment relatively quickly, even if it is refrigerated, you want to make small amounts of fruit ferments. Because what will happen is after a few weeks of being refrigerated, your fruit ferment will start to go into the alcohol phase. So start with small amounts and plan to eat them within a few weeks. Otherwise, in the case of cranberry sauce, you're going to wind up with a boozy cranberry sauce. Now, you have some options to help slow down that fermentation process when you're fermenting fruit. And one of those options is to introduce some vegetables into your ferment. Now, today we're just going to make a basic cranberry sauce, and I'll talk about later how we go about sweetening it. But if you want, you can also start with making fruit ferments in the form of a chutney. So you could basically take your cranberries and maybe add in some grated onion or chopped celery or different things like that. And those vegetables, or in the case onions, things that are in the onion family, will start to slow down the fruit fermentation process. So sometimes for beginners who are new to making fruit ferments, it can be a little easier to make a savory chutney. However, don't worry, if you want to just make a basic cranberry sauce that's on the sweet side, as opposed to a chutney that would be on the more savory side, we are going to do that today, and I'm going to help you to be successful at it. Now, the key is you don't want to introduce any additional sweetness into making your cranberry sauce. So all you want to use is basic filtered water. Filtered water works best because tap water with the chlorine can sometimes interfere with the fermentation process. So if you can have filtered water or bottled water, spring water, things like that, if you have well water, that works very well. But if all you have is tap water, it's not the end of the world. I've sometimes used tap water in making ferments, and they've turned out okay. I think it really depends on the level of chlorine or other chemicals that are in your local water. So you may be wondering, if we're just going to use water and we're not going to introduce any sweetness, like maybe making the cranberry sauce with orange juice, how do we eventually get this flavored, especially since we're definitely not going to add sugar or honey at this fermentation stage? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to let our cranberries ferment. And once they reach that lactic acid stage, which I'll explain in a minute how to recognize that, We then are going to dump our cranberries into a bowl, and at that point we're going to add whatever sweetness we want to add, whether it's sucanat, which is your whole dried cane juice, or maple syrup works very well. You can add honey at that point, whatever you want. You can even use white sugar if you want, if you're still at the beginning of your journey from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen. And then you're going to mix it up really well. You're going to taste it to see if it's to your liking, the sweetness is to your liking, and then you're going to put everything back into a jar, and then you're going to refrigerate it immediately, and then you're going to make sure that you eat it within a few weeks. Alrighty, well, now that we've got that beginner lesson under our belt, we can get ready to make our cranberry sauce, our fermented cranberry sauce. So let's go over the ingredients that we're going to need and the equipment that we're going to need. But don't worry about writing any of this down. If you open up the description under this video, there'll be a link. It'll say recipe, and there'll be a link next to that. If you click on that, that'll take you over to my website where you'll have the printable recipe. You can print it out, you can read it online, and it'll have all the ingredients and the complete instructions on how to make this fermented cranberry sauce. Now, in terms of ingredients, the first thing that you're going to need is about 3 cups of raw cranberries. And just look them over and make sure that you don't have any that might be rotten or soft. Those you want to get rid of. Next, you're going to need a 1/4 cup of whey. And how you get whey is by straining some yogurt. You just want to strain plain yogurt. A Greek yogurt often has a lot of the whey already strained out of it, so you may not get much whey from that. And an interesting point that I want to make that actually a viewer had shared with me, she had purchased yogurt that also contained pectin, and she had a hard time straining that to get whey out. So make sure that when you buy yogurt, you just buy, first of all, plain yogurt with no flavor, and make sure that it's a very natural yogurt that basically has milk and active cultures in it, and no additional additives or added ingredients. Then basically what you're going to do is line a colander. You can line it with a coffee filter or some cheesecloth or a flour sack towel. Those are favorites of mine, whatever you have. And then you're going to pour your yogurt into the lined strainer, and you're going to let the whey drip out. It may take a couple of hours, it may take a little bit longer. And then basically you're just going to have a very watery, somewhat whitish or yellowish colored liquid. That is whey. It's very rich in probiotics, and it's wonderful, which is good bacteria, which is wonderful for helping with jump-starting ferments. Now, as I've shared with you in the past, I'm not a fan of using whey when I make vegetable ferments. However, when it comes to fruit ferments, whey works very well, and the taste it imparts is fine. Now, unlike vegetable ferments, with a fruit ferment, we're going to cut way back on the salt. But we are going to use some salt. And the reason is, salt in ferments helps tamp down the bad bacteria while allowing the good bacteria to get a foothold in your ferment. Now, I really like to use coarse ground sea salt. It's that wet gray sea salt that you may see sold at the store or online. And I like this because I find this always works very well with my ferments. And you can usually find this at places like the Celtic Sea Salt Company. I think they also the company goes by the name Selena Naturally now. And they sell a wonderful wet gray salt. And it's very coarse. But the nice thing about this coarse gray salt is that it's very rich in minerals and it helps the ferment. Now, in the case of the 3 cups of cranberries, we're only going to use about 1/2 tablespoon of the coarse ground sea salt. Now, if you don't have this coarse ground sea salt, but you have another type of sea salt and one that's a fine ground sea salt, then you're really going to cut back to maybe 1/4 tablespoon, because I've got 1/2 tablespoon of the coarse ground sea salt, and so you'll want to go with just 1/4 tablespoon of the fine ground sea salt. Now, when it comes to making fruit ferments, you have 2 options. You can make a cooked fruit ferment, or you can make a raw fruit ferment. If you want to make a cooked fruit ferment, What you would do is take your 3 cups of cranberries and 1 cup of water and cook your cranberries until they popped and were soft. And then you would let them cool completely. And then you would put them in your jar and proceed with your steps with the whey and the salt that start the fermentation process. But I prefer to do a completely raw fruit ferment. Now there are a couple of different ways you can prepare your raw cranberries to go into your jar. You can whirl them in a food processor. I don't recommend a blender, but you can whirl them in a food processor until they get a little chopped up. But you want to be careful, because the more chopped up your cranberries are, the quicker the fermentation process will move along, and the quicker they may move to that alcohol stage. So you can take a few at a time and just start to give them a little rough chop, nothing fancy, or you can just go ahead and put them into the jar, which I'll show you what I do, and just start to macerate them with, as I've shared with you before, what I call a kraut pounder, what you use when you're making sauerkraut. And what I like to do is just put some cranberries in here, get my kraut pounder, and just, it takes a little elbow grease, but really you're not looking to cut them or totally mash them, because they're very hard. But you're just splitting them ever so slightly. That's going to allow the brine that we're going to make get into them and start to ferment them. And you can also at this point start sprinkling in your your salt. That helps break them up as well and gets it nicely distributed throughout the jar. Now I find doing it this way in the jar is very easy, and it helps keep everything contained. But if you want, you can also just start using your kraut pounder, or if you don't have a kraut pounder, like a wooden spoon or a spatula, and you can just start macerating your cranberries in your bowl and then transfer them to your jar. And you see when I put a little weight on it with this kraut pounder, the cranberries start to split. Now for 3 cups of cranberries, I'm using a quart-sized jar, and you want to make sure that it's nice and clean. Yes, you can sterilize it, or as long as it's been washed with warm, hot, soapy water and allowed to air dry, it should be fine. But for a quart-sized jar, about 3 cups of cranberries is perfect. And a quart-sized jar is a good amount to make, unless you think you're going to be eating a lot of fermented fruit. As I said, you know, it only lasts a few weeks in your fridge until it does start moving into that alcohol phase. So making a small amount to start is wise. Next, we're going to take our 1/4 cup of whey and go ahead and pour that right down over our cranberries in the jar. Next, I'm going to start pouring some of my filtered water over these cranberries. We want to make sure everything's submerged, but I do want to leave a little room because we need to put a weight in here. Because to allow for the fermentation process, we need to keep these cranberries completely submerged under the brine. Now, if you have the glass fermentation weights, they work great. But if you don't have those, don't worry. What I find works really well is a little jar. And I like these little canning jars. They're just known as jelly jars. They're 4-ounce jars. And I'll just go ahead and put one in, and then I'll just push it down to see if I need to add more water or whatever the case may be. But what I like about these jelly jars is as your ferment ferments, it can sometimes bubble over and liquid can come out, but when you use these jelly jars, the liquid often just goes right into the jelly jar. So that works very well. Now I think that this is going to be perfect. I'm just going to add a touch more liquid, but I think this jelly jar will keep everyone nicely submerged under the brine. Oh yeah, that looks great. Then what you'll want to do is take your cap, if you have the canning lid and the canning ring that may have come with your jar, because what I'm using here is a quart-size canning jar, you can definitely use that. Or if you've got just one of the basic storage lids, you can use this as well. I'm just going to put that on, and by screwing this down, it puts pressure on that little jar to hold everything under the brine. Just like I mentioned, if you have the glass fermentation weights, you may also have the pickle pipes. And the pickle pipes are something that if you have the canning ring, you can put the pickle pipe on top of your jar instead of the canning lid, and then you can just use the canning ring to hold that pickle pipe down. And there's a reason why people use the pickle pipe, but you can also use any other type of fermentation device that is out there. There's a lot of different lids made for fermentation, and if you have them, great. You can definitely use any of those and be very successful. But I know that a lot of folks may not have those different accessories, so I want to show you very basic ways of doing this with equipment you may already have in your kitchen. The only difference is if you use this system where you are just using a little weight, like, even if you're using one of those glass weights or a little jar like this, and you're just using a canning lid or a storage lid, you will need to burp your jar. Whereas with those different apparatus that are made for fermentation, you don't need to worry about that. But if you are using this system, once a day, and maybe even a little more, maybe twice a day, you're going to want to check and you're going to want to see as bubbles start to develop, that's CO2, and you need to be very careful because that is building up pressure. And so you want to make sure that you loosen your jar lid, let out that pressure, that gas that's building up, and then retighten your jar as quickly as possible to let in as little oxygen as possible, because oxygen is the enemy of ferments. So just keep your eye on this as the bubbles start. Just release, let that CO2 out, and then give it a twist to close it back up again. Now, when it comes to ferments, the fall is a great time to do this because ferments like to be somewhere, and this is an average for most ferments, like to be somewhere between 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's kind of typical for fruit and vegetable ferments. So find a place in your kitchen that you think will be somewhere in that temperature range, and then put it hopefully in an undisturbed area. And you also want to make sure that you keep it out of direct sunlight, because ferments don't like extremes. They don't like big temperature swings. And if it's in sunlight and it starts to get very warm, kind of above that 72 degree Fahrenheit, and then may drop down in the evening to below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, it doesn't like that. Now, as that CO2 gas begins to build up during the fermentation process, which is a byproduct of the good bacteria, it's giving off that CO2, and that's a good sign. But what you might want to do is take your ferment and put it in a bowl like this, because even if you've made your lid very tight, this is not completely airtight. And as that fermentation starts to bubble and starts to take hold in your cranberries, some liquid may dribble out a little bit. Or another problem that may happen is when you go to burp your jar, the pressure that has built up in there with the CO2 may drizzle down. And having this in a jar just keeps everything a lot cleaner. And a question that I get a lot is, can you go ahead and just put this in your pantry? Do you need to leave it on your kitchen counter? And no, you don't need to leave it on your kitchen counter. I tend to just find a little quiet place for it where it's out of direct sunlight and is in about that 68 to 72 degree temperature range. And I don't put it into my pantry because I'm always worried that I'll forget about my ferments and I'll forget to burp them if I'm using this more old-fashioned system. So, but yes, if you have a good memory or you post things on your pantry door to remind you, you can definitely put this in your pantry. And let me just clarify, when I say put it in your pantry, I mean put it in your pantry for the fermentation process. Eventually it's going to go into your refrigerator. Okay, so what are you looking for so that you can catch this during the lactic acid stage and then go ahead, if you choose, as we'll talk about, sweetening it and then getting it into your refrigerator? What do you look for? As the bubbles start building up and you're getting a lot of activity And you're starting to see some foam building up here along the top, especially if you've done this in a cooked version where it's a little bit more of a mush, so to speak, and there's a lot less liquid. It's ready to be sweetened and put in your refrigerator. So the minute you start to see that, we're going to move on to the next step. And literally at this time of year, when it is still a little warm in our kitchens, I'm in October, making this in October, and I'm in Central Texas, so here it's still quite warm. But no matter where you live, if you've got the heat on now and you're baking and you've got your oven going, and so that your kitchen is somewhere in that 68 to 72 degree Fahrenheit range, it's going to ferment very quickly. So keep an eye on it, because this could be ready in as quick as 2 to 3 days. So if you start to see a lot of bubbling and a lot of activity, you're ready to move on to the next step. Now, I just want to mention one thing about adding additional flavorings to this. As I said, I don't want you adding any orange juice, nothing like that. That's a very sweet fruit or a sweet juice that's really going to speed up the fermentation process and make it more difficult for you to catch it during that lactic acid phase. But if you want, at this point when you're adding in your cranberries and your salt and you're macerating your cranberries, you can go ahead and add in a little citrus zest. If you like adding some orange zest, you can add some grated ginger. You can put a cinnamon stick, maybe right down the middle. So there are other ways to flavor this with various herbs and spices without adding additional sweetness that will speed up the fermentation process a little too quickly. So I'm going to put this in a cozy place out of the way in my kitchen, and once I start seeing that activity, I'll bring you back, we'll sweeten it, and I'll show you what you need to do to get it into the fridge. Well, between 36 and 48 hours, I started to notice a little bit of bubbling. And I'll overlay a picture so that you can see what I'm talking about. And so I released the lid to let out some of the CO2, the carbon dioxide, and I had just a little bit of liquid in the bowl. When I got closer to 72 hours, the third day, there was a lot of activity and I had quite a bit of liquid in my bowl. So when I released the lid to let out the CO2, I also took a sniff to see how it smelled, because you want to catch your fruit ferment before it starts to smell yeasty or almost like beer, because then it's starting to move into the alcohol phase. But it still had, just trying to describe it, it's sort of like a tangy, if you've ever smelled like a sauerkraut or fermented pickles, just sort of has that tangy, not quite vinegary, because that would mean it had gone way too long. It's more of just like a tangy aroma. But I don't want you to worry if you're making this for the first time and you're not quite sure, does it smell right, does it not smell right? Generally, within 3 to 4 days, when you start to see that really active bubbling, it's time to move on to the next step and get ready to refrigerate your fermented cranberry sauce. If you get to the point where it's a very strong yeasty smell or a very strong beer-like smell, then it has moved into that alcohol phase, and that can happen as quickly as around 7 to 8 days. But I've generally found where I live here in Central Texas, where, as I said, October, November, it's still a little mild here, and so I know somewhere in that 3 to 4 day range is going to be an appropriate time. So, but if you're making this for the first time and you're not sure, don't worry. As I said, that's my ice maker. As I said, when you really start to see a lot of bubbling activity, it's ready. Now I'm going to go in with clean hands and I'm going to take out the little jelly jar. And as you'll see, it's already itself filled with some liquid. Even though I had some overflow into my bowl, I've also had overflow into my little jelly jar. And I'm just going to go ahead and add that right back in. Now, a little tip I want to share with you is, if you notice I'm using a dark burgundy colored towel and I'm wearing dark colors, is because the cranberry brine can stain. So it'll come out in the wash, but I just want to give you a heads up on that. Now, what you're going to notice, once it becomes very effervescent in that 3 to 4 day, maybe 5 day range, depending on the temperature in your kitchen, the fruit will float to the top. And you'll notice there's just, so you'll see a little bit of liquid on the bottom. You'll see a lot. And the reason the fruit's floating to the top is all that CO2 gas is lifting it up. Now, what you want to do at this point is drain the brine. Now, don't discard it. We're going to be using it. And if we don't use all of it, we still want to save it. But what you're going to notice at this point is that the brine has really become very rich in color, that red, deep cranberry color, and the fruit has softened considerably. Now, you're going to notice that your cranberries have become very soft. You can easily squeeze them between your thumb and forefinger. Everything will be very soft and will have been beautifully macerated by the fermentation process. But in case you feel that it's not quite broken up enough, that it's not macerated enough, you can take what you've strained out of your brine, just dump it into another bowl, and then just go and get your crowd pounder or a wooden spoon or a spatula, whatever you have, and then you can just get in here and start breaking up any berries that you feel are not soft enough. And I'm going to give you a little trick. If you have a pastry cutter, or even if you wanted to do this with 2 forks, but the pastry cutter works really well if you have one of these on hand, and you can get into your bowl and just go over your cranberries with your pastry cutter. It'll break everything up and at the same time almost cutting the cranberries. Now, once you have the cranberries chopped up to your liking, the fun part begins. We get to sweeten these. And really, you have a lot of options. I like to use a raw, unfiltered honey, but you could use maple syrup. You could also use one of the powdered sweeteners like sucanat, or which is sugarcane natural. It's simply sugarcane juice that's been dried. You could use date sugar, you could use maple sugar, you could use coconut sugar. You have a lot of options. The only thing I recommend that if you use one of the dry sweeteners, pulverize it first to the point where it's a powdered sugar. It'll blend much better with the cranberries. Yes, the granules will dissolve after a few days, but sometimes it can take a little time. And if this is something you want to eat pretty quickly, I would recommend using the powdered form. And you can just do it in a blender or a little coffee bean grinder, whatever you have, and then it'll blend in beautifully. Now, amounts. For the 3 cups of cranberries, I like to use between 1/4 cup and 1/3 cup of honey. And the same goes for maple syrup. With your powdered sweeteners, you'll want to experiment. I would recommend starting, with maybe 1/3 cup to 1/2 cup and see what type of sweetness level you like. But I find with honey, 1/4 to 1/3 cup works well. And I tend to like it a little on the tangy side. So sometimes I even just go with 1/3 cup. But since this will be for everyone in the family to enjoy, I'm going to go ahead and add in 1/3 cup of honey. Next, you just want to take a spatula and mix in whatever sweetener you've used until it's completely distributed evenly amongst your cranberries. Now, after you incorporate your sweetener, you can just check and see if you like the consistency of your cranberry sauce. If you feel you want a little more liquid, you can go ahead and add in more of your brine, or you can just leave it like this. Now, I'll show you how to decant this before we get ready to put it in the refrigerator, but I want to mention something about this brine. Do not throw this out. This is very rich in probiotics, and there's a couple of different things you can do with this. You can save some of it to use the next time you make a fruit ferment, and this will help jumpstart it in addition to the whey and the salt that you're using. The other thing that you can do with this is put this in a glass with a little bit of sweetener and a little bit of ice, maybe a little seltzer or some type of carbonated water, and you can make a lovely, as they say, mocktail, a lovely beverage to enjoy, especially during the Thanksgiving and Christmas season. It's so colorful, it's rich in probiotics, it's got that great cranberry flavor. It'll also have a cinnamon or a ginger or a citrus peel flavor if you've added any of those to your original ferment. And then you know, as I said, you add a little sweetener, a little seltzer, put a straw in it. It's lovely. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and just decant this right back into the jar in which you fermented it. Just clean off the rim, put your cap on, and put it in the refrigerator. And then for Thanksgiving, you can put it into a bowl and put it on your table, and you're all set. But what I like to do is decant mine into smaller jars. This is just an 8-ounce jelly jar, but you can use whatever you want. And the reason that I like to do this is then I can just put these around the table on Thanksgiving. It looks very homemade, and anybody who wants to enjoy fermented cranberry sauce can go ahead and use this little jar. And, you know, I can put multiple jars on the table depending how many people I have around the table. And it's also a good way to differentiate it from the traditional cranberry sauce that's cooked and made with white sugar and so on and so forth, that people may enjoy eating instead of fermented cranberry sauce. So it's nice to have that option. And then you can just go ahead, put the cap on, put this in your refrigerator, and then come Thanksgiving, you can just put it on your table like this, so that everybody knows, okay, this is the fermented one. And it's also handy when you go to eat leftovers and you just want to pull out a little bit and not the whole big jar. So I hope that you'll enjoy this. And now, if you'd like to learn how to make more fermented foods, including sauerkraut, specifically fermented vegetables, and pickles, and how to ferment tomatoes, and also how to make giardiniera, which is a wonderful Italian vegetable mix, but how to ferment it, be sure to click on this video over here, and I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.